On a late autumn evening, the city's pulse had slowed to a sleepy rhythm. Streetlights smeared themselves across rain-polished pavement, and the glassed storefronts glowed like watchful eyes. Evelyn Hart moved through the crowd with the kind of tiredness that permeates bone deep. 12 hours of meetings, a single stale coffee that refused to revive her, and the gnawing anxiety of an intern whose future felt like a question mark. The bus arrived as if on cue. The hiss of doors and the shuffle of bodies folding into one another. Evelyn found an empty seat in the middle, small salvation in a crowded carriage. She sank into it and let the world tilt away. Opposite her sat a man who seemed to belong to a different city altogether. He wore a charcoal suit that hugged his frame with casual elegance, a watch with a leather strap peeking from under his cuff. His hair was the color of midnight and unruly in a way that made him look both deliberate and disheveled. He stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in his steady dark eyes as if they were measuring something only he could see. Evelyn paid little attention. Her eyelids were closing like curtains, the muscles in her jaw finally surrendering to the exhaustion. When the bus hit a pothole, her head tipped and found the curve of his shoulder like a small and improbable harbor. She didn't notice the faint scent of cedar and rain that clung to his coat, didn't register the warmth of the place she tucked her cheek against. The gentle sway and the low hum of the engine stitched a lullaby, and she fell into a sleep so immediate and so wholehearted it surprised even her. The man startled only slightly at the soft weight. He glanced down at her with something like amusement and an unnameable softness. When the bus jolted again and she stirred, he leaned away as if to give her room, but every time the movement stilled and his gaze returned. There was a small, private indulgence in being the island upon which someone else sought refuge. For a moment, he allowed himself to be that. When Evelyn woke with the sudden panic of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, she realized with a heat flush of embarrassment that she had been sleeping on a stranger's shoulder. She bolted upright, knocking a paper cup that tipped and sent hot coffee like a dark comet across his shirt. Her apologies tumbled out in a frantic rush, words tripping over one another, hands swiping at the stain with napkins that came out of nowhere. The stranger remained calm. When he laughed, it was soft, surprised, and it caught her off guard more than the stain did. "Don't worry about it," he said. His voice was measured and unexpectedly warm, the kind that felt like a steadying hand. He refused her insistence on paying for dry cleaning, deflecting with a casual smile that felt oddly personal. Evelyn, cheeks burning and heart still racing, fled the bus with the sensation that she had left a small piece of herself behind. She spent the rest of the night replaying the sequence in a loop. The tilt of his jaw, the hint of a smirk, the mundane miracle of being allowed a moment of repose without judgment. She told herself it was nothing, just a city-made moment among many. Still, the memory lingered like a bright thread through the gray fabric of her exhaustion. It would be an easy anecdote, she thought. Shameful, clumsy, then forgotten. Morning arrived, brittle and bright. Evelyn ran her fingers through her hair, thrust a laptop under her arm, and walked into the glass and steel building where dreams and dread were welded together. The day carried a nervous electricity. It was presentation day for the interns. The moment where months of scribbled notes and late-night edits were meant to coalesce into something that merited recognition. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and concentration. Interns shuffled in like fledglings, each one armed with the same fragile confidence. Evelyn's palms were slick against the remote as she sat down, rehearsing the words under her breath when the door swung open and his presence filled the room like the arrival of a storm. A hush fell. He moved with the kind of economy that suggests control. Slow, deliberate, commanding. When he stepped to the head of the table, Evelyn recognized him in an instant. The man from the bus, but different now, transmuted into something else entirely by the crisp authority of a name. He was Alexander Vale, someone whose face might appear in the business pages, someone whose opinions shaped campaigns and boardrooms. Her stomach plummeted into a place where nerves and hope performed a clumsy dance. He listened to her presentation with an intensity that felt like an interrogation, then asked a question that landed like a cold stone. Evelyn steadied herself, thinking faster than she had ever had to. She answered with the careful conviction that comes from the hours when a person watches their future take shape on the edge of their choices. When he nodded, something in his eyes suggested approval rather than mere curiosity. She left the room with more than relief. She left with a hush of recognition that maybe the world contained small mercies. That evening, tucked into her desk lamp's pale circle of light, Evelyn thought of the bus and of the man who had let her sleep. She did not know then how small a hinge that one moment would become in the swinging doors of her life. The office had a heartbeat of its own. Emails pinging like distant thunder, heels clicking in a polite cadence, the soft murmur of strategy and spreadsheets. Evelyn returned to her seat after the presentations with a sense of exhausted triumph. She believed she had done well, but one never really knew how the room had received courage until someone said as much out loud. The day folded itself into hours of cleanup and tentative congratulations when an assistant arrived at her desk with an expression that was both polite and guarded. "Miss Hart, Mr. Vale would like to see you in his office," the assistant said. The words should have been ordinary, but they landed like an invitation to an unfamiliar world. Evelyn's heartbeat stuttered. She had not expected a summons. For all the industry and the applause, she had assumed that the fate of interns was to remain small and steady, like a candle in a corner. For the first time that day, the city seemed to tilt. Alexander Vale's office was on a high corner of the building. The windows framed the skyline with an indifferent majesty. Inside, the room was a study in restraint. Clean lines, leather-bound books, a solitary photograph on the shelf that suggested a past the man rarely displayed. He stood by the window when she entered, hands in pockets, a silhouette against the glass. "Evelyn," he said, turning, "you handled yourself well today." It was the kind of praise that arrived with weight. He closed the distance between them in a few easy steps and sat down across from her, folding his hands on the desk as if preparing to negotiate something more than business terms. "I have a project that requires more than good ideas. It needs someone who can think and move fast. I want you on my team as a temporary assistant." The offer landed like a key on a locked door. Temporary assistant, the words fluttered in the space between them, carrying with them the possibility of late nights, fierce learning, and proximity to decisions that shaped the company's future. It was the kind of opportunity that could carve a path out of the maze. For a moment, Evelyn felt the old, familiar fear. She was not like the others who moved through these halls with a cool certainty. She was an intern, green and earnest, stitched together with grit and a stubborn hope. Yet there was something in the texture of his invitation that erased patronizing subtext. It was respect wrapped in possibility. "Why me?" she asked, the question both practical and private. It was simpler than the list of possible reasons. Her presentation, the angle she had taken, the fact that she had not flubbed when asked to defend her data. "You see patterns others miss," he said. "You worry about who the customer becomes, not just who they are this quarter. That matters." She accepted because she knew she would. She accepted because some doors opened and you could either stand before them forever wondering what lay beyond, or you could walk through trembling and hopeful and leave the wondering to those who never dared. Work under Alexander Vale was a maelstrom of high expectations and razor-sharp feedback. He moved through problems with a surgeon's precision and a poet's appetite for nuance. He pushed Evelyn in ways her professors never had. He demanded specificity, encouraged contrarian thinking, and applauded rigor. Their sessions stretched for hours, brainstorming that blurred into arguments, arguments that cooled into quiet repair, small victories that tasted like champagne because they were rare. The office watched, of course. They always do. For her colleagues there was curiosity, for some thinly veiled resentment, and for others a pragmatic acceptance that the boss had his reasons. There were whispers in corners about favoritism until they were replaced by curiosity. And finally, professional admiration as Evelyn's work began to show results. Yet alongside mentorship, there were moments that blurred the professional boundary in ways Evelyn tried to chart and failed. Alexander had a way of leaning into silence that felt less like dominance and more like invitation. He offered critique without humiliation and praise without condescension. He teased with a dry wit that revealed a gentler interior. There were evenings when they worked late, the city outside a black ocean and the office lights a fragile constellation. They shared coffee and fragments of their pasts, hers filled with books and tight budgets, his with travel and an absence that tasted like regret. Each revelation was a brushstroke that made the picture more complex. They were not friends, not yet. They were a pair of people who had discovered a shared rhythm in a chaotic landscape. On a rainy Thursday, when a campaign projection threatened to crumble beneath an aggressive competitor's move, Evelyn stood before him with the quiet confidence of someone whose late nights had paid off. He listened and then did what he always did, sliced away the unnecessary and coaxed out the kernel of brilliance. "We'll run it," he said simply. The relief that spilled over her was not for validation, but for the fact that someone with so much could choose to trust someone with so little. That night, as Evelyn walked home under an umbrella that hummed with the city's drizzle, she thought about how a chance nap on a bus had turned into an invitation to a life she once imagined but had not dared claim. The path ahead was ambiguous and perilous and brimming with possibility. She was, for the first time, willing to be brave enough to see where it might lead. The rhythms of their partnership settled into a kind of intimacy that was professional on paper and otherwise entirely complicated. Evelyn often arrived before dawn, the city still yawning, to find Alexander already immersed in the day's problems. Market shifts, campaign pivots, spreadsheets that begged for narrative. He expected more from her than mere competence. He expected curiosity and courage. She answered in kind, sometimes tiring herself into a clarity that surprised her. Working closely with one person every day is a slow process of knowing. The small things register. The way Alexander tapped his pen when he was thinking, the exact tilt of his head when a plan appealed to him, the way he drank his coffee, black with the barest sip stolen between edits. Evelyn learned the rhythm of his moods as if learning a new language. It became dangerous, she realized, to know the cadence of someone and to mistake its presence for permission. Alex, as he allowed a select few to call him when fatigue removed the formality of his public persona, had a manner that disarmed. He was both architect and critic, demanding yet protective. He offered feedback that sometimes felt like a caress, sometimes like a reprimand. There were evenings when he would drop by the intern floor because he claimed he liked the energy, and his visits were composed of sharp questions and sharper smiles. When he teased her about minor missteps, she corrected herself with a sort of laughter that covered an unexpected warmth. Rumors rose and fell around the office like seasonal birds. People made assumptions and assigned motives where there were none. Evelyn learned to keep her head down, to let her work be the loudest thing she offered. But gossip has a way of gnawing. Whispers that once felt like background noise began to ring in her ears. She started to notice the way colleagues' gazes lingered, the way conversations softened when she entered the room. Sometimes, on the tram home, she would replay small moments, trying to determine what line had been crossed, if any. She wanted answers from Alexander that she did not dare request. In private, their rapport deepened into a kind of moral apprenticeship. He pushed her to consider long-term value over short-term applause. He made space for her ideas, but demanded they be anchored in data. He taught her to ask not just what a customer wanted now, but what they would need when the novelty had worn off. You could not fake that kind of thinking. It required patience and the sort of careful observation Evelyn had always thought of as a quiet talent. One evening, after a grueling strategy session, they lingered in the conference room while cleaning crews moved through the halls, like ghosts. Rain stitched the windows in silver threads. Alexander, usually composed, placed a photograph on the table, a small, creased image that reminded her of an old Polaroid. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when he ran a thumb over the face in the picture. "You never asked about my family," he said suddenly, his voice soft. "And you never asked about mine," she returned, truer than she meant. He told her then, in shards and comfortable silences, about a childhood that had been empty of permanence. His father had been a man of ambition and distance. His mother, a delicate memory stored in a single drawer. He spoke without dramatic flourishes, but with a quiet ache that explained much. Evelyn's guard lowered in ways she hadn't expected. She offered stories of her own. A mother who worked 2 jobs in a hometown that smelled like baked bread and stubborn hope. The exchange was not a confession so much as an exchange of fuel that warmed the early hours. Amid their professional interdependence, a current ran that neither named nor denied. Moments of unwanted stillness where their hands brushed across a page, a look that lasted one faceless second too long, a laugh that felt closer than it should. Alexander would sometimes watch her with a gaze that seemed to catalogue rather than conquer. He saw her the way a designer sees a raw material, full of potential, exacting interest. But the world outside the office was not oblivious. Jealousy, like a shadow, slipped into the edges of their lives. Alexander had friends and confidants who observed the pair with a skeptical eye. Evelyn had colleagues who whispered about how fortunate she was, and those who implied a quieter agenda. She sometimes wondered whether the narrative others wrote about them would ever align with what actually pulsed between them. The office, after all, loves a story more than it loves truth. Then came the day when a senior executive publicly lobbed criticism at one of Evelyn's projections. The man, a veteran steeped in risk-averse thinking, dismissed her work with a scornful flick of the hand. The room folded into an awkward silence. Evelyn felt the heat rise to her face, a bitter taste of exposed vulnerability. She braced herself for humiliation. Alexander, who had been listening intently, set his jaw and cut across the room with the economy of someone who knew the value of intervention. "That's enough," he said, his voice even and cold with absolute authority. He defended the integrity of her data, the methodology, and the reasoning behind her projection. He asked the room to engage with facts, not with dismissive assumptions. There was to shift then, less seismic than it felt to her inwardly. Colleagues looked at her differently. Not with the pity she had feared, but with something like respect. In that moment, as alarms faded and attention returned to the work, Evelyn understood something fundamental. Defense can be a rare kind of affection. It is not always tender or romantic. Sometimes it's simply being seen and protected when the world threatens to reduce you to a misstep. Still, within Evelyn, a line remained. They were mentor and mentee, architect and apprentice, 2 people moving in the same orbit with different gravitational pulls. She watched Alexander with a small, contained wonder, but with the caution of someone who had learned to keep affection at a distance. The heart, she knew, loves to blur borders. The smart thing, she had been taught, was to draw them with care. Time, when spent in close quarters, has a way of accelerating and stretching all at once. Evelyn's calendar filled with client meetings, late-night edits, and the kind of rapid-fire problem-solving that left little space for idle thought. Yet between the deadlines and the adrenaline, there were pockets of quiet. Mornings where they drafted emails together, evenings where they shared the same silence across a table strewn with analytics, and the occasional lunch where conversation drifted from KPIs to childhood curiosities. As their professional synergy strengthened, so did a magnetic pull that neither acknowledged outright. Alexander's comments took on a personal tinge sometimes, a softness not present in his exchanges with others. Evelyn found herself noticing the small flares of protectiveness in his tone, the way his eyes would linger when he thought no one watched. Those moments existed in a space that was at once electrifying and terrifying. It was inevitable that internal politics would intrude. Gossip crept in like ivy, insidious and pretty. Whispers began at the perimeters, a shared elevator, a grin misinterpreted, a rumor that circulated like wildfire through cubicles and LinkedIn timelines. There were colleagues who assumed the worst and those who chalked up her assent to nothing more than office favor. Evelyn felt the unfairness of its sting. She had earned her place by late nights and careful thinking, not by charm. She had to fight a pervasive idea that women who rise quickly are somehow unmoored from merit. Despite the noise, she and Alexander shared moments that felt startlingly private. One night, the office empty save for them, a joke slipped out of him that was half genuine, half an attempt to lighten the pressure cooker atmosphere. She laughed with abandon, the kind that unlocks something raw and honest. He watched her laugh as if committing that small detail to memory, and in that instant, anything professional that lingered between them felt fragile. The tension reached a precipice when Evelyn, overhearing a conversation, learned that Alexander had told a colleague he was contemplating staying away from entanglements at work. The words had an air of definitive resolve, a line drawn in the sand. Evelyn felt something cold and stubborn settle in her chest. It was confusing. A man who praised and defended her, and then declared himself unavailable. Perhaps it was caution, or a relic of his carefully controlled life. Perhaps it was fear. Whatever the reason, it hurt. She made a decision that was less dramatic than it felt. A request to transfer. It was presented as a strategic move, the kind that could broaden her experience and prevent any perceived conflict of interest. She told herself it was about career trajectory and professional integrity. In the HR office, with fluorescent lights and forms that smelled faintly of institutional resolve, she signed the paperwork and left without drama. Still, as she walked away from the suite, a hollow opened where something luminous had lived. Alexander did not protest publicly. He maintained his professionalism, his eyes as unreadable as ever. For a while, they were two people who saw each other through the polite distance of office acquaintanceship, nods in the hallway, polite emails, a deliberate avoidance of the private jokes that once rounded the edges of their conversations. The first week apart was quiet and orderly. The second began to ache. Time can do strange things to a heart. Absence does not always make it fonder in a gentle way. Sometimes it sharpens like a blade. Evelyn adjusted to her new role, a demanding and respectable slot that promised career growth, but also a fresh loneliness. She met new teams, learned new rhythms, and carved a professional reputation that dwindled the whisper of favoritism. Still, late nights returned like an unwelcome guest. The city felt bigger and emptier all at once. For Alexander, the separation was a slow revelation. Without the cadence of her presence, the office felt efficient but incomplete. He noticed, with a chastening precision, how much he missed the ease of collaboration. He missed the quick-fire conversations that spiraled into better ideas, the companionable silence, the small, private humor. He realized, with the clarity of someone who had been denying an obvious truth, that the distance had been less about propriety and more about his internal attempt to protect both of them from something he could not yet control. When he saw her laughing with someone new, a junior executive named Marcus, whose admiration for Evelyn was plain and complimentary, something inside Alexander shifted. The sight of her smiling, bright and unguarded, was a reminder of how much he had allowed himself to lose. Jealousy surfaced suddenly, an animal reaction that startled him into action. He found himself crossing floors he had avoided, seeking presence not for business but for the selfish need to be where she was. He interrupted her with a request to speak, an arrangement that felt rushed and inevitable. The office hummed around them like a chorus on the verge of revelation. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Not with the casual formality of a manager, but with the vulnerability of someone who had been honest with himself in the most private parts of the night. Evelyn, who had rehearsed answers in the quiet hours, told him the truth she'd told HR. The transfer was strategic. Yet in the soft spaces between words, she revealed the ache of being a step away from something that had been honest and dangerous and unexpectedly tender. "You told me you'd stay away," she said quietly. The small resentment of someone abandoned. "You chose that." He looked at her then with a gravity that made her catch her breath. "I thought it was right," he said. "But thinking and feeling are different things. When a confession arrives, it often lands more heavily than you expect. It changes the geometry of the room. It makes future choices unavoidable." They stood then at a precipice of decisions, not simply about career or reputation, but about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to say what their silence had been shaping for months. Alexander's admission was a key that unlocked a door both exhilarating and frightening. The office around them hummed with efficiency and casual indifference. Yet between the two of them, a new terrain was being charted. He did not promise epiphanies or grand gestures. He simply said, with a kind of weary clarity, that he had tried to stay away because he believed it was better. For his career, for hers, for the fragile balance of professionalism. But distance, he confessed, had proven a poor substitute for truth. Evelyn listened, cataloguing the way his jaw worked when he spoke, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that softened when he was earnest. She had told herself she had left for logical reasons. She'd told herself she wanted to succeed without the shadow of questionable arrangements. Yet the truth had a way of pushing its way through the neat arguments you file away for safety. She had missed the cadence of their collaboration. She had missed being seen. They tried in fits and starts to define what might come next. It was not just a question of hearts and hesitations. It was a careful negotiation of careers, reputations, and the responsibilities Alexander carried. He was a man who belonged to more than himself. Words like public perception and conflict of interest threaded through the small map they drew. Yet love, when it chooses to insist, rarely attends to policy memos. The office became a theater of private calculations. Evelyn found herself walking a careful line between desire and decorum. She continued her new role, proving competence at every turn, but now she carried with her the knowledge that someone of authority both loved and feared what that affection might cost them. There were meetings with HR, subtle adjustments in her routing of work, and an unspoken agreement to keep certain interactions professional. But human beings are not machines that run on memos and policies. They are climates of small impulses, and those impulses began to rearrange the furniture of their lives. Alexander started to find excuses to be near her department, dropped off reports, casual check-ins that were no longer strictly necessary, invitations to collaborate that came with a private note. Evelyn, for her part, watched him with an attention that was not only professional. She noticed the softening of his defenses and the quiet ways he tried to make room for her. When he invited her to dinner in a public way, standing in the cafeteria and saying it loud enough that the room went still, there was a ripple of surprise and, for some, delight. People took sides in their minds, and the office filled with 100 small narratives. Evelyn's face flushed at the spectacle. There was fear, certainly. To be the subject of company gossip is to be reduced to a character in someone else's story. But there was also a liberation in being named in public, in being offered more than a private solace. She accepted with a trembling courage. The dinner itself was not an opera of romance, but a conversation stripped down to essentials. Their respective fears, the potential consequences, the reasons why each of them belonged to fragile, broader systems. They spoke of the possibility of a future without pretense, of building the scaffolding so that their personal lives would not dismantle the professional structures Alexander had spent years creating. It was tentative, pragmatic, and earnest, the kind of talk that could either spell doom or build the foundation for something steady. Yet life, as it does, offered no clean script. An offer came to Evelyn from a prestigious firm in another city. Higher salary, rapid advancement, a chance to step into a role that could define her career. The letter arrived like a small bomb, infecting the quiet confidence they had been building with the hard geometry of decision-making. It was a dream she had worked toward since she first learned to edit metrics and coax a story out of data. For a woman who had lived modestly, the offer shimmered like a promise. She sat with the envelope on her lap for hours, staring into the window at a city that had begun to feel like a seam between two lives. On one side lay a possible future with Alexander, a relationship that might demand compromises but could be rooted in mutual respect and growth. On the other lay the offer, a chance for independence, professional leap, freedom from the complex orbit of a powerful man. Both roads held losses and gains. When she brought the offer to him, the conversation they had was a mirror held up to both their vulnerabilities. He listened without theatrics, and then, to her surprise, he encouraged her. "You should take it," he said, steady and almost gentle. "You've earned it." The assertion that he would not ask her to sacrifice her dreams for him stunned her. It was both noble and painfully honest. She had expected a different reaction, pleading, bargaining, an attempt to tie her to the city by emotional argument. Instead, he offered agency, but that very agency pulled at something tender inside her. If love is a force that asks much, sometimes what it asks of you is the hardest thing to give: autonomy. Torn between career and connection, Evelyn chose to accept the offer. It was both an act of ambition and a test. Could love survive distance, or would it reveal itself as a temporary illusion? The night before she left, they stood at the threshold of her small apartment, a liminal place where the voicelessness of unsaid things seemed loudest. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that was more monumental than any proclamation. "I don't want to say goodbye," he murmured. She laughed and cried at once, clutching his jacket as if it were a lifeline. "Then don't," she whispered. They held the space between them like a fragile object, not yet knowing whether it would survive packing and planes and pride. The city she moved to smelled different in the first light. Sea air threaded with unfamiliar spices, streets that moved with a wider, less familiar pulse. The job was everything she'd hoped, challenging, luminous, and profound in the way it demanded her to stretch beyond her comfort. She threw herself into it with a fierce focus that was both comforting and a form of exile. Work, she reasoned, would dull the ache of leaving. Still, late at night, when the lights of the new skyline blurred into long, soft lines, there was a hollow the city could not fill. Weeks turned to months. Letters and messages passed between Evelyn and Alexander with a rhythm that alternated between intimacy and formality. They spoke of projects, successes, and setbacks. He sent reports that read like old habits of collaboration. She sent critiques and small victories that became a private ledger of mutual growth. But the physical distance weighed like a small stone in the shoe. Calls that once lasted late into the night shortened into logistics and daily recaps. There were silences that thickened, like breaths caught and held. Evelyn tried dating, in the polite, cautious way people do when they're testing whether new faces can replicate an old, particular warmth. Dates blurred into one another. Coffee, polite laughter, conversations about aspirations that felt performative. None of them reached the clarity of what she had once had with Alexander. The city offered many things, but not the particular contour of his presence. For Alexander, distance was a classroom of hard lessons. He learned, with a bitter clarity, what absence can sharpen. His desire, his regret, his capacity for envy. He realized he had been cowardly to default to neat boundaries rather than confront his own fear of mixing the personal with the professional. Watching Evelyn from afar, seeing glimpses of her life through the occasional message and a photo, he felt a profound emptiness that had nothing to do with business. The company functioned. Charts rose and fell, campaigns launched and landed. But in the quiet center of his day there was a hollow that only Evelyn's voice could fill. Months after Evelyn's departure, he placed a simple envelope on her desk, an old habit, an old chance. Inside was a bus ticket and a note, terse and unmistakable. "I'm still waiting. Don't fall asleep this time." The gesture was small, but it detonated something fundamental inside her. He had not tried to manipulate or to grandstand. Instead, he had reached out in a way that asked for presence without demanding it. The bus ticket was an invitation and a confession rolled into one, an admission that he had been waiting, and that waiting had been an act of hope rather than resignation. She did not hesitate. She bought a last-minute ticket on the first bus that would take her back across the city lines. She ran through streets that felt foreign until they became familiar, heartbeat matching the cadence of memory. When the bus stopped where it began months ago, he was there at the sign, hands in his pockets, radiating the same composed warmth she remembered. They stood apart for a moment, the world orbiting them but not touching the private gravity that drew them closer. She ran into his arms like a person who has wandered through seasons and found home. He kissed her with relief that belonged both to regret and to a relief so sudden it left them breathless. In the crowd of the city, amidst the ordinary flurry of life, they found a private silence. They spoke then with a clarity that was both tender and practical. There were no grand declarations that promised to erase the difficulties of the past. They acknowledged the complications, power, perception, future goals. Yet in the quiet of that reunion, those difficulties felt surmountable because they were shared and owned. Evelyn realized, as she watched him, that his gesture had been about more than romance. It had been about recognition. He had waited. He had chosen, finally, to be vulnerable in a way that mattered. She, too, chose to leap, not into recklessness, but into a partnership where both ambition and affection could coexist if navigated with care. The bus that carried them home felt small and private, as if it were transporting a new constellation of promises. They did not speak of easy resolutions. Instead, they planned a roadmap that acknowledged both the bright demands of their careers and the fragile, beautiful fact of their love. They would be honest about limits and transparent about fears. Above all, they would choose each other, not out of convenience, but out of the stubborn conviction that some people are worth the risk. Once reunited, Evelyn and Alexander set about weaving their lives together not through denial, but through intention. They did not erase their separate ambitions. They reconfigured them to fit the new landscape of two people who loved and respected one another. They met with HR to ensure boundaries at work were clear and professional. They mapped contingency plans to handle any potential conflicts. They negotiated public transparency when necessary, while guarding the private intimacy that sustained them. There were awkward moments, of course. Colleagues who wondered, clients who speculated, and the occasional reminder that power imbalances can complicate affection. Yet they met each challenge with a combination of candidness and dignity. Alexander used his influence not to shield Evelyn from the rigors of growth, but to ensure she had space to flourish. Evelyn, in turn, remained fiercely herself, ambitious, precise, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. Their relationship matured like a carefully tended garden. There were seasons of bloom where their collaboration produced campaigns that reshaped markets. There were quieter months when life demanded less spectacle and more steady, mutual presence. They argued, occasionally boiling hot, and then reconciled with an honesty that made re-knitting easier. He learned to ask for what he needed without commandeering her choices. She learned to accept love that did not require surrendering her autonomy. Outside the office, their life was simple and rich in unpretentious ways. They cooked together in a small apartment that smelled of garlic and lemon. They walked through parks and pretended to be tourists in their own city, marveling at the slow things that make an ordinary life luminous. They celebrated each other's successes with genuine pride. She would watch him quiet and attentive as he read a report late into the night, and he would marvel at the way she made courage look effortless. There were moments that still surprised them. A photograph tucked into a book he'd left on her desk, a note on a napkin, a spontaneous trip for the weekend. They did not grandstand. Instead, they collected small intimacies like postage stamps, each one a testament to continuity. They learned to negotiate ambition without making it a rival to love. They discovered that the work that once defined them separately could also be something they shared. Years later, when they looked back, the bus ride would become a kind of origin myth, romantic enough to be retold, honest enough to be true. The city had been a stage for their missteps and triumphs, a place where two people from different maps could choose to redraw borders together. Evelyn advanced into roles that matched her competence, and Alexander learned how to build a life that included vulnerability next to victory. In a company meeting years after they first met, Alexander introduced Evelyn not as an intern, but as a partner in vision, both at work and in life. The room applauded, not for their romance as gossip, but for the undeniable contributions they made to the company's direction. It was, for them, a quiet kind of vindication, a proof that love, when anchored in respect and matched by talent, can coexist with ambition rather than derail it. Their story was not a fairy tale free from hardship. It was, instead, a narrative stitched with work, patience, and the kind of bravery that chooses honesty over comfort. They learned that love could be a foundation rather than an obstacle, as long as both people kept building on it day after day. And on some rainy evening, years after the bus had first hummed its way through the city, Evelyn and Alexander would find themselves standing at the same bus stop where everything had begun. They would glance at one another, smile without speaking, and remember how chance nudged them into each other's lives. They'd step onto the bus, not to escape but to move forward together, two people who had chosen courage over convenience, love over fear, and each other over the predictable certainty of a life unlived.